Good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Welcome to this webinar on clinical evidence requirements for Europe, Australia and China. I'm Arthur Brandwood. I am the founder and principal consultant of Brandwood Biomedical, and I'm going to host your webinar which will be delivered by Tammy Ahmedada, one of our senior consultants based in Sydney. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words about Brandwood Biomedical, just very briefly. We are a medical devices and IVD, regulatory and quality and technical consultants. We are headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We have offices in Beijing, China, in Hong Kong, in New Zealand, and a network of very close partners across the Asia Pacific. We support companies to address global markets. We started life a long time ago supporting Australian companies going to the US and Europe. Since then we have a worldwide client base looking at markets in Europe, the Americas and the Asia Pacific. We're going to specifically talk today a little bit about clinical evidence requirements, but it's interesting that those requirements have been increased substantially around the world by regulators reacting to public events and concerns about particular devices. That's why we, as a company, spend a lot of time working with regulators, becoming networked and engaged. We think that's important because not only does it give us a good perspective on the way regulators are seeing the world, it allows us to do our job better. We spend time delivering training. We have trained many of the Asia Pacific regulators. We'll be organizing some biocompatibility training in China later this year, for example. But enough of that. That's the end of the obligatory commercial. Now I'd like to bring on to the more interesting part of the webinar. Before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. You should be seeing a screen something like this. You'll notice the little orange arrow on the control box. If you click that orange arrow, and you should see it open up a box like this. As we go through the webinar, if you have a question, you'll see there's a little box there, enter a question for staff. Type your question in at any time. We'll collect those together, and at the end of the delivery of the webinar, we'll do a question and answer session and answer as many questions as we can. If we don't get through them all, we will come back to you by email with a brief answer to every question that's put. Enough of that. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tammy Ahmedada. Tammy is a senior consultant here in our Sydney office. Tammy's been with us for some years now. She has a particular expertise in preparation of clinical evidence reports and provides that service to multiple clients, and has done so for Australian regulatory submissions and for other international jurisdictions. So Tammy, over to you, and I'll let you deliver the presentation.
Thank you, Arthur. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on clinical evidence requirements. So Arthur's already given you the kind introduction and an overview, so I'll get straight into our agenda today. On today's agenda, I will first be starting off with just about, you might notice this title, Rise and Rise of Clinical Evidence. For those of you who follow our newsletters and blogs, there has been a hot topic and there has been quite a lot of talk. So I'll just introduce you to why the regulators are talking about clinical evidence and the need to have this rise in clinical evidence requirements. I'll then move on to what is clinical evidence and just, I guess, a general overview as to what it actually constitutes. I'll also go through some of the local requirements in 3 particular countries, in Australia, Europe and China. One of the main reasons is that these 3 jurisdictions have particularly released new guidances, and there's some particular requirements in each jurisdiction that I'd like to talk about. I'll move on to then the key elements of a clinical evidence report, and I'll go over really what are some of the general requirements of a report, and then what are some of the local differences that need to be addressed for each country. And finally, just I guess just the global approach. So I'm sure that there are many of you who are sitting there wanting to tackle multiple markets, and for those of you who want to really enter multiple markets with the clinical evaluation, I'll go through just how you can approach this from a global perspective without missing out on any local requirements. So firstly, the rise and rise of clinical evidence. So why is there this need to increase the requirements for clinical evaluation? And in response to that, I've just got two familiar pictures. One is of a fractured PIP breast implant, and the other one is of an eroded joint prosthesis. So these two pictures really are a reminder for not just us, the regulators as well, as to the need to have to make these pre-market requirements tighter. There's another sort of health or risk aspect to it, and that is it was these type of devices that would have gained market approval, and when it comes to post-market, we don't want any harm to the patient or to the population. So regulators are in particular becoming more, I guess, cautious as to what kind of devices they can approve. And that's really the need or the reason why there's been this rise of having more clinical evidence data before your device gets approved in any market. So next one is really about what is clinical evidence. In a nutshell, in brief, I've got it into a simple equation, which is about taking your data, so taking all of your clinical data wherever you've drawn it from, evaluating that data, and then presenting that as your evidence in a very nutshell, in a simple equation that talks to quite a few jurisdictions. That's really what clinical evidence is data, but it's also an evaluation of data, which is a key step. Moving along then, as I mentioned, data can come from a wide range of sources. So some of the typical ones that I've got in here would be obviously your clinical trials, if there is any trial data done. Preclinical studies, this will be your biocompatibility, any preclinical verification tests done. Literature review, which is another key source of data. Post-market clinical experience data, and also risk assessment. And these are the key or the major elements of a clinical evidence, which I'll come back to later on. But essentially, these are your sources of data. Now, that was really just a general overview as to what clinical evidence is. It might seem very simple, but essentially it is just drawing out all the relevant data and evaluating it relevant to your device. I'll just move on to now just some local or specific requirements in Europe, Australia and China. So I'll start off in Europe because I know that's very common for a lot of you there. So I've got the extract here from the MEDEV guidelines, and without going into too detail into the paragraph, I've got the keywords highlighted there, and that's clinical performance and safety. Those are the two, I guess, magic words for any clinical evidence report. How can you establish safety and performance of your data? And you'll notice just the last sentence there talks about it includes data specific to device in question, as well as any data relating to devices claimed as equivalent by the manufacturer. And as we go through what sort of China says and Australia says, you might find some of the differences in what the requirements say. But essentially, in Europe, the requirement is you present yourself data relating to safety and performance either on the device itself or a device that you can establish as being clinically equivalent. Okay. Here I've got an extract of the guidelines for medical device. This is the MEDEV guidelines applicable in Europe, and I'm sure most of you will be very familiar with this, but this guidance document takes you through just the key elements of a clinical evidence a notified body would be assessing against. And includes, I won't go in detail into this, but the key headings there are going from the beginning, describing your device, what clinical indications, and then how the literature search is conducted, and what the justification is for not going through clinical trial data, looking at post-market, so on and so forth. That's just there as a reference point for anyone who hasn't come across this before. That's really talking about requirements in Europe. Now, to sum up, well, not to sum up, I guess some of the key local requirements in Europe I've got here is, firstly, clinical evaluation is required for every device, irrespective of the classification. As I'll mention later on, it's different in China, for example, where Class 1 devices don't require clinical trial data. But in Europe, whether it's Class 1 or Class 3, you must have a clinical evidence data or report. The extent of clinical data is normally dependent on the risk of the device. So if it's a low risk or Class 1, obviously, the requirements for clinical data will be lower than a high risk device. Again, for those of you who have seen our published blogs and posts, you would see that we've mentioned the draft European regulations, which mandate direct clinical trial data for any Class 3 devices, unless there could be a justification for an alternative approach. But regulators are heading towards trial data for high-risk devices. So something to keep a lookout for. Literature reviews, if they are done, must have a detailed search criteria as well as inclusion and exclusion criteria. If the data is used from another device, it must be established as substantially equivalent. And the substantial equivalency is really based on similar intended purpose and key technical and biological characteristics. This might mean for material, could be same critical product specifications, and so on and so forth. And so for any difference, if any two products have any differences, it must be a justification as to why that won't pose a safety or performance outcome in practice. But those are sort of the key messages or key points that are drawn out from a European clinical evidence report. An overview of the actual clinical evaluation process. Now, I've given the extract from the MEDEV guidelines before, but here's just a snapshot and overview of how to conduct a clinical evaluation process. Within this little funnel, I've got the 3 primary categories of data or sources of data you can obtain from, being the literature, post-market data, and also clinical trial data. And as a guidance, normally clinical trial data is required if the technology or the device is new, it's novel, or it's unproven, and the design is basically novel, or if it's an existing technology but it has a new clinical use or a new clinical indication that currently is not found anywhere else in other devices. So in these cases, you typically be expected to present direct clinical trial data. If, however, the device is based on an existing technology or the intended use is established and it's got accepted use, then you can take the other pathway, which is the literature, drawing all the data from literature to provide the support for your device. And essentially, once you've collected all the information from these sources, the second part comes really about evaluation. So if you remember the equation at the beginning, the funnel is really the data, and these 3 things here, the output is really your evaluation. The evaluation involves looking at what hazards and risks can be associated with your device, what are some of the performance aspects that can be encountered in clinical use, and also what are some of the favorable and unfavorable data. Overall, which data is saying that's not favorable, which ones are saying they are favorable, and what's the level of evidence that's associated with them. And that's an important aspect because, as I'll mention later on as well, you can have a review article or a randomized control data that points out or is not so much favorable for your indications, but then you might have a single case report of a patient who underwent a particular procedure and they had positive outcomes. So you have to weigh up the evidence and look at which one's got a higher quality, and overall balance the data out and look at what it's saying. Is it really favorable or more unfavorable? So in a snapshot, that's really the clinical evaluation process. If you go into Australia, again, so the particular extract from Australia is that manufacturer of a medical device must have clinical data in the form of either or both clinical investigation or literature review. Again, I've highlighted the key keywords there, being the clinical investigation or the literature reviews. At the moment, Australia doesn't mandate that you have to have the clinical trial data. Of course, if you can justify that you can have data from the literature, and that's extracted from the therapeutic goods regulation for your reference. Again, going through now Australia key local requirements, it is very similar to what we saw in the MEDEV guidance. So the TGA does look at MEDEV guidelines, and it's pretty much similar requirements in terms of particularly predicate devices or what to include in scope and how to conduct the literature reviews, even though Australia might be more detailed on that, but essentially the requirements are the same. And clinical trial data is typically required, again, if there's insufficient data you can get from the literature. If you remember from the funnel, again, if your clinical indications or your product doesn't have enough data from existing sources of literature, then you might need to go through clinical trial data. And the third one, which is really more of the local requirement than the above two, is the CV of a clinical expert. And this is, I guess, one of the standout of Australian local requirements. The clinical expert has a defined definition. I've highlighted the key keywords in there, being that the clinical expert must have the qualifications relevant to the device, as well as clinical experience relevant to the device. And previously there has been a misconception that the clinical expert must be a physician or a surgeon for all devices, but it is really relevant to whatever is relevant to the product. So for example, you can have a qualified nurse for general hospital disposable equipment, and that makes sense because they're the ones who actually deal with them on a day-to-day basis. Versus if you've got a device such as an endovascular stent, then you're going to need a cardiovascular physician who deals with these devices to endorse the report, because they will have the knowledge and expertise to be able to judge and endorse the findings of your report. For those of you who are not aware, although we've talked about this quite a lot, there is a draft clinical evidence guidelines out by TGA. It is still in draft, but it's a very detailed guidance, and it again goes into depth as to what sort of elements of a clinical evidence report needs to be presented. It goes into depth about substantial equivalent devices, and in particular the section I've highlighted in my slide here is about requirements for specific high-risk devices. So listed there, the guidance goes specific to these particular products, the joint prostheses and cardiovascular devices and things like that. It doesn't necessarily, again, mandate that you have to have clinical trial data, although clinical trial is definitely preferred, but it's really a case-by-case basis. You might have a prosthesis that's very novel in design, or the actual design is based on a predicate, but even minor differences might make the outcome different in clinical practice, and it can get very difficult to justify the clinical equivalency for high-risk products, because of high-risk devices, only because the risk would be high in clinical practice. But it is there for your reference. Again, it's very detailed, or you can visit our website. We have done a nice summary of these guidelines for your future reference. Moving now on to China. So China also, I've got the extract there for the requirements on clinical evaluation, and highlighted there are the three key sources, basically clinical evaluation from literature, clinical experience data, which is the post-market data, and clinical trials. And you can see that the actual sources are very similar across all, so it's either literature or clinical trials, and also including post-market data. But I'll go through just there's some local differences in China which don't exactly mirror what Europe and Australia have. So key local requirements. The first one is that clinical trial data must be done in China for Class 2 and Class 3 devices unless you can justify that they can be exempted. And I'll go through in a bit more detail later on. Clinical trial is not required for Class 1 or if the devices is listed on the catalogue of the device exempted from clinical trial. Now this catalogue is updated regularly by CFDA, and it basically includes a bunch of Class 2, Class 3 devices which don't need to go through clinical trial. So if your device is under that category, then you are exempt from doing in-China clinical trials. If the data is required from another device, which is the predicate must be approved or registered in China. This is very different to Europe and Australia because the substantial equivalency is really based on key technical biological characteristics as well as similar intended purpose. But for China, it must be a device that's already approved in China. And in China, predicate devices must meet the requirements that are set out in a series of comparison tables, which I'll go through in a moment. But essentially the comparison table, what we're seeing here is leaning towards how FDA 510K comparisons are laid out. So it's more of an expansion of the FDA 510K predicate analysis, but I'll go through that in a bit more detail. Essentially, key local requirements in China that differentiated from Europe and Australia is that requirement that must be, if you need to do clinical trials, it must be done in China, and the predicate must also be registered in China. And for class 1, and there are some devices that have to be included on an exemption list for you to avoid clinical trials. The process in China there is just summarizing this flowchart here. So beginning with your actual device, so remembering class 1 don't need to go through clinical trial, but for class 2 and class 3, the first question to ask is, are there any differences in China to the equivalent product? And this will be, if the answer is no, if it is an identical product or the manufacturer's own product, then you can just prepare a clinical evaluation report which contains the key elements as per the MEDEB guidelines, your literature review, post-market, etc. However, if there are any differences with the product and the predicate, then we have to do an analysis as to whether that affects the safety and performance. And it's a broad heading because it really depends on, it's a case-by-case basis depending on the device, but you must have a clear justification that the difference between your product and another one doesn't affect the actual safety and performance in clinical practice. And if you can establish that equivalency, then it could be done in the form of a report. Otherwise, you must conduct in China clinical trial. And that's essentially the process. The process, again, is not all that different to what we're used to, in that if something is similar, you just justify any differences. But again, China again has a bit. I think they're a bit more stringent on the predicate devices because they must meet particular, more detailed criteria, and again, they must be approved in China. So exempted or not, as I mentioned, CFDA does publish a list of devices that don't need to undergo clinical trials, and if at any case a manufacturer finds that the device is not listed on that on the list of exempted medical device, then what they can do, they can apply for the exemption based on the data from a predicate device. So that the predicate analysis becomes very important. And just a note there that the exemption list is really for medical devices at this point, not for IBDs. So some of the examples of exempt devices include most disposable hospital devices such as forceps, scissors, etc. These ones are all listed on the exemption list. ECG, some ECG machines are also listed, as well as some medical laser equipment and some traditional Chinese medical equipment. This is by no means the definitive list. There's a long list of devices that are exempt, but just to give you an idea, these are just some of the categories of devices that are exempt from clinical trials. So here's then going on to the comparison tables. Now, as I mentioned before, what we're seeing here is something very similar to an FDA predicate analysis, but it does include a lot more detail, a lot more categories. It's almost as if it's an expansion or a more detailed version of the FDA 510K analysis or the predicate analysis. And this particular table is to be used when you're trying to establish equivalency between a new device and a predicate which has already been registered in China. As you can see, the key headings there are basic working principles, manufacturing materials, the actual composition, performance requirements, the method of sterilization, intended purpose, method of use, so on and so forth. There is then a separate table for inactive devices, and similar categories there, but it also has some things such as national standards, other indications applicable to them, and manufacturing materials as well, and production processes, so it's a bit more detailed. Also things like contraindications, delivery state, precautions, packaging, so on and so forth. There is also then a separate comparison table for active devices, and as you can imagine, the active component, this table will involve things on the electrical components, and as you can see, it is quite detailed. But to establish clinical equivalency with a predicate device, it's a little different to what the draft TGA guidance and also the MEDEB guidelines prescribe, because they do have some examples. So the key thing is that they have key technical biological characteristics. So Europe and TGA give examples of such characteristics, such as the biocompatibility, but it doesn't have a prescribed or something like a list like this that we're seeing for establishing equivalency. And that's just a continuation of that list. That's just there for your reference. Now, the key challenges in China to presenting a clinical evidence report is firstly just availability of in-China predicate clinical data. So unless it's of course your own device or the manufacturer's own device, then it's really hard to get data from a competitor product, and you need that to actually establish to be able to use their data and establish equivalency with yours. Second one is then availability of the in-China predicate. The predicate definition and the requirements in China are more stringent than Australia and Europe, just based on the review of the guidances. Almost as if when you read the China, you have to think you have to have the identical product registered. So it is, for comparison study, you do need a lot more detailed information on the subject device and the comparator device. And if you are unable or if you're unsuccessful to go through the literature survey and the predicate device pathway, then the other challenge is that the mandatory trials must be done in China to meet the population, and the challenge there is a shortage of resources, and it is also a costly process. And lastly, pre-submission consultation. So at the moment, there's no formal access or formal pathway to approach CFDA, discuss your product, and come to an agreement as to how you present your clinical data. And that's essentially covering those 3 jurisdictions. The last agenda point is really about how you can take a global approach, and obviously planning efficiently in advance if you want to enter multiple markets. And the first advice really is to know the guidances. In Australia, as I mentioned, there's a draft clinical guidance out on medical device and its clinical evidence requirements. In Europe, we've got the MEDEV guidelines, which is a detailed guidance document which talks about the key elements of the clinical evidence report. And China, there's a recent guidance out on clinical evaluation of medical devices. So keep a look at and know your guidances to be able to understand what the local requirements are within that country. The second one is know the actual local requirements, and this may come from the actual guidance documents, but first one is the clinical trial requirements. As I mentioned, in Europe and Australia, you don't necessarily have to have trials done within the country, or you may not be able to even have to do the clinical trials if you can use literature to support your device, whereas in China it's a bit more strict. Although I did mention earlier as well that Europe has published a draft guidance, which they are leaning also towards requirement that Class 3 devices must have clinical trial data. So for high-risk devices, it's definitely the preference across the countries, but in China, for example, it needs to be within the country, and there's some local differences in how you can establish equivalency with predicate devices. Second one is robust literature review. I guess this is one aspect that doesn't differ too much between the different countries. In all countries, if you are using the literature pathway or even to present a clinical evidence report, the literature review does need to be quite robust. It does need to have a detailed search criteria, and also how the data is actually filtered and how the data is evaluated. There's consensus amongst the jurisdictions that the literature review does need to be quite objective and need to have a critical appraisal of the data. The other one's post-market data. Again, I think this is also another aspect that's similar across all regions. So you can draw on in-house customer experience data from your within the manufacturer's database, or you can use other databases such as FDA MORE database or the TGA database of adverse events for drawing out some of the information on similar products or equivalent products. Predicate device requirements, as I mentioned, they do differ a little bit between the different countries. China's got the comparison tables, and Europe and Australia provide guidance as to what kind of details to consider to establish the equivalency. But again, just know the requirements for establishing the clinical equivalency. And lastly, the clinical expertise requirements. So I think Australia here stands out in this aspect because they specifically require a clinical expert to author or at least endorse the report. And as I mentioned, clinical expert has to be someone who has the qualifications as well as experience that's relevant to that device. In Europe, it is a requirement that you need to have it authored by an appropriate clinical expert, but the definition is different to TGA. It just needs to be a suitably qualified clinical expert to be able to analyze the data and write up the clinical evidence report. You don't necessarily have to have the clinical experience in Europe. Whereas in China also, you don't necessarily have to have a clinical expert as per TGA definition to endorse or sign on the report. Post-market data, as I mentioned earlier, there's several sources of data you can draw on from. So you can get it from the public FDA MAUDE database, or in-house, you can compile from your in-house customer feedback database, or any reports of clinical experience with either the actual product or similar products. Equivalent. I've got this here a little, just a little balance here. When you've identified your risk from your literature, looking at the performance failures and complications and patient risks, how can you mitigate that with your device risk assessment? That's another key document I've mentioned earlier in the webinar. So a risk assessment looking at how you can mitigate it through IFU, your training, preclinical tests, or your labeling, and the conclusion from a clinical evidence report is really drawing a favorable risk-benefit ratio. For further reading, and I know most of these have been really based on theory because particular devices, it's a case-by-case basis, but we've got quite a few publications on clinical evidence report and just guidance on key elements, and this is just a snapshot of our website and our blog page for your further reading. And that brings me back to the end of the webinar. Really, to sum up, clinical data is really about drawing on data relevant to your product, evaluating that data, and understanding the local requirements. And at the end of the day, then drawing on that data and presenting a favorable risk-benefit ratio. And on that note, I think it's time now for taking any questions. So what I'll do is I'll give a few minutes. If you've got any questions, as Arthur mentioned at the beginning, just put it in the text box, and we'll give a few minutes to gather all the questions and we'll go through them. So I'll hand over to you, Arthur, to have a look at some questions.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, and thanks for a fascinating presentation. We've got a bunch of questions here already, so I think we might launch straight in. Stephen Wen is on the line with us from our Beijing office, so I'm going to actually throw the first question to Stephen. Stephen, David asked the question, is it possible to submit original clinical data from overseas to the China FDA? Can you talk a bit about what international data is acceptable in China?
Okay, so in general, for overseas legal manufacturer, they need to follow the Chinese the clinical requirements. So as Tammy introduced, you either do the clinical study in China or you follow the clinical evaluation path, or unless your device has already been put into the exemption list. But in the meanwhile, for the overseas legal manufacturer, you also need to submit the original clinical data from your country of origin or any other countries in the world as a reference to CFDA, but it cannot replace the local clinical data or the clinical evaluation report following the Chinese guidance. Some people said, some CFDA reviewers said that if your original clinical report in other countries can meet the Chinese regulations, they can also accept that. But that's not proof yet, because it's hard to judge whether your original clinical report meets China requirements like the GCP or some local regulation. So it's not proof yet. So we will keep our eye on that. So at this moment, you better submit either the local clinical data or follow the clinical evaluation path.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a question here from Romit, who says, clinical evaluation report draft guidance, that's the TGA guidance, also requires that the clinical expert provides a recommendation. Now, Tammy, you've covered that, but it's still something that's a little confusing. As you pointed out, the European guidance also says that the report must be compiled by somebody with expertise in the device, but that definition of expertise is slightly tighter in Australia, isn't it? And usually the way to do that, I think, is most companies will have the device clinical evidence report written by a product expert who may be an in-house person, but then you bring in an external independent clinical expert to review. Can you just talk a bit about that? I think that's my understanding, but you know this better than I do.
Sure. Yeah, so in the past I have seen clinical evidence reports that have been reviewed by notified bodies, and then also reports that have been reviewed by TGA. So the comments have been different. In one instance, as Arthur mentioned, the expertise is really relevant to the device, and it doesn't have to be an actual experience with the device, but someone with relevant qualifications. So it may be, was an example I can give without being an actual product specialist, but I can't think on the top of my head, but the key difference is from TGA's feedback, the clinical expert must have the experience within a clinical setting, so whether if it's in a hospital setting or whichever, whereas those that are in the MEDEV guidelines don't necessarily have to have the experience for it, but they could be quite knowledgeable in that field.
So in Europe, for example, you might have a product specialist who's been involved in the device development and design and the clinical trials and so on will author the clinical evaluation report.
That's
but
correct.
In Australia, you actually have to have a clinician. That's the difference. It's got to be a relevantly qualified clinician.
That's right, and as I mentioned before, who the clinician will be dependent on the device. So if it's things like disposable hospital equipment, then it could just be a nurse. Otherwise, for implantable devices, you would need an actual surgeon who deals with those devices.
Okay. Thank you. Back to Stephen again. Stephen, George says, what's the main difference between the China guidances and the GHTF guidances, the Chinese Clinical Evidence Report guidance and the one from the GHTF, which I think was the basis of the European guidance? Can you comment on the key differences in the guidance documents?
Yes, sure. So first of all, so the China CFDA's guidance about the clinical evaluation was written based on the GHTF guidance, but it does have some more requirements. So first of all, as Tammy introduced, CFDA requests you must have a predicate device which is approved in China. So this is a very, very tough requirement. For example, even your device to register has a lot of clinical evidence worldwide, but you don't have any predicate device approved in China, then you cannot do the clinical evaluation test. You have to either get your products on the exemption list or to do the clinical study in China. And second, the China's evaluation guidance has much more detailed or specific requirements on the data analysis and the categorization. And it does request you to do the data analysis by statistical method, like a meta-analysis. So that's it's a challenge. And lastly, the guidance also requires you to justify the variance to the predicate device. You can provide any like testing report or risk analysis report or the clinical data to justify the new features to on the new device. So I think that's the three critical points of the China CFDA guidance.
Thank you, Stephen. Another question. I'm just looking here. There was a question, I think, from Sean that said, are there other additional guidances we need to be aware of? Now, Tammy, you showed a nice slide of the TGA draft guidance where you pointed out it had a whole series of chapters specific to particular device types. Mm-hmm. Stephen, I'm also aware in China there are a number of guidances that speak to conduct of clinical trials for particular device types, for example, stents. That's the case, is it not? And I think what you see in the Australian guidance actually mirrors what's available in device-specific guidances in the Chinese market.
Yes, that's true. So, in addition to the general guidance covering all types of devices, CFDA also trying to develop the guidance for some individual type of devices like stent, like X-ray machine, or MRI, etc., or pacemakers. Yeah, those guidance give more specific requirements, such as the criteria, the endpoint of the study, and the number of the patients, something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think it would be fair to say that that's the case in multiple jurisdictions. We haven't discussed the United States in this webinar, but certainly the US FDA produces many product-specific guidances, and a lot of those have got more specific details on expectations for clinical data, particularly for higher risk devices. Let's move on to another question. For Tammy, Jean asks a question about doing the literature review and says, can you just expand a bit more? She knows that TJ has very particular expectations of literature review. Can you did talk about that, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by the specific requirements for doing the literature review?
Sure. So some of the key components of a literature search, first is having a detailed or defined search criteria, actually detailing what sort of even Boolean operators you use when doing the search. The other thing is defining your inclusion and exclusion criteria, so having a detailed documented search criteria basically. And the inclusion and exclusion criteria will relate to the actual product indications or contraindications and so on and so forth. And some of the things can include even device related. So again, if your particular product is contraindicated in a particular area of the body, you might exclude articles that talk about that particular aspect. Or you can have inclusion-exclusion criteria based on, say, you only screen for review articles, or the dates you might look at only articles within the recent ones within the last 5 or 10 years. So really having a defined or detailed search criteria is something that I've seen TJ ask quite a lot, and I've seen as a deficiency in a lot of reports from manufacturers.
And they really, I think the measure I've seen is that you need to define your, to describe and define your literature review in terms of the databases and the search criteria and the inclusion-exclusion criteria in such a way that the regulator can replicate the search. Is that correct? And actually, I've seen that. They say we need enough information that we can do this ourselves and verify that you've been complete.
Yeah, that's right. So the actual exact phrase used is that the search must be detailed enough in order for another person to replicate the actual search criteria and the search strategy applied. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. We're just coming up to the end of our time here. Pablo asks, can you develop your substantial equivalency from more than one device? For example, materials from one device but the intended use from another device in a similar indication. Now I know in the United States these days the FDA in its 510K process is quite specific and says they're looking for single predicates, but that's not the case here, is it? Your literature review should be broad-based, correct? And look at evidence from a number of different places.
That's correct. So often the approach I've seen some manufacturers take is they will pick or nitpick a few devices and they'll say we're going to base our clinical evidence report based on these 2 or 3 products, and they'll go in detail looking at substantial equivalence. And by doing that, they actually eliminate a whole bunch of other data that may just generally talk about these devices or may miss other sort of equivalent devices. So I guess the approach I've seen normally is just to go the other way. So establish your search criteria, your literature search criteria, and when you come across existing literature that talk about a particular device, then you can draw on and say how that device relates to yours and how that could be equivalent. So it's not really limited to pick one device, make that equivalent, and then provide a clinical evidence report. It's really about finding the data that's related to your product, and then if it's using a different device, then establish equivalency between yours and the other.
Thank you, Tammy. I think we'll stop at that point. We've got a fair few more questions here on the screen. What we'll do is we'll compile these questions together into a list and provide a few dot point answers to them and circulate them to everybody who's attended. I'd like to say thanks very much to our speaker, Tammy Ahmadzada, and to our expert panelist from Beijing, Stephen Wen, for your input and for what's been a fascinating presentation here. And thank for all of you. We've had a very large number of people on this webinar, larger than normal, and for your questions. We've recorded the webinar, we will publish a recording, and we'll circulate the list of questions and answers afterwards, and we'll also put the slides on our website. I'll direct you to brandwoodbiomedical.com. There you can see not just this webinar, which will be out shortly, but all of our recent webinars, and you can review them there, as well as the blogs on clinical evidence. Just go to the blog page and type in clinical. You'll find most of them there. Thank you again, and good day to you all.
Thanks, everyone.